Okay, enough of Stand By Me. That's a really good movie if you haven't seen it, by the way. You should watch Stand By Me. One of my favorites. Oh, okay, everyone. You see what we're talking about right here. Vroom. They lived. That's the... There you go. They did live. They didn't all die. So today's topic... Oh, fuck. Yes, you're right. Nashi. Thank you very much, Nashi. I forgot. I always forget. Whoops. I always forget something. I thought I went through everything. Like, look, I updated the subscriber thing up here. You know? I changed the header down here. But still, I forget something. Every time. Okay, I updated it. Thank you very much, Nashi. Okay. No, we are going to play the Talos Principle again, actually. We'll do that tomorrow. Oh! Sorry, before we talk about philosophy of mind, don't know if you saw my tweet on Twitter, about a conversation that I'll be having soon with a doctor who was involved in the Canadian blood donor scandal, which in the early 90s was a absolutely massive controversy in Canada, where over 30,000 people contracted HIV and hepatitis C due to infected blood being distributed to blood donor clinics. And it took almost 5 years before medical authorities said anything about what happened. And even further, the media didn't even pick up on it until, 3 years into it. So, yeah, over 30,000 people got infected with HIV or hepatitis C. And this doctor played a role both in... So he was called as an expert witness during the litigation period, obviously during the lawsuits that were leveled against these medical authorities. And he was also a doctor that was practicing as well, on the good side of the story, of course. So I'm going to be talking to him, hopefully both about the role that he played in the role in fighting that scandal and uncovering the truth of what really happened. And then talking more broadly about the ethical duties that medical practitioners and authorities in medical science owe to people. And I think that's so important right now, given the COVID pandemic, and the fact that as a general populace, we have to be able to have trust and belief that what medical authorities are telling us is actually legitimate, right? And here's a very clear case where medical practitioners and medical authorities and the government completely failed the general populace. So we'll talk about the specifics of the blood scandal, then we'll abstract a bit more into the general bioethical duties that medical practitioners ought to follow when they're doing their practices, and then connect that to the current COVID pandemic. And I'm really excited to talk about this. I'm just finishing up a book on the crisis because I don't want to go into a discussion not knowing the facts about the case. So I'm just finishing a book on it. That's why it's taken me a little bit to wrap everything up on it. I've also been reviewing my bioethics notes as well, just so I can remember a bit about it. And yeah, so I'm really looking forward. It's currently tentative, like there's no date set or anything, but they've expressed interest in talking. It sounds like this is going to happen and should happen, sooner or later. So keep following for more updates on that. And then, like I said, the Boomer Zoomer podcast is coming probably in the next 5 days. No, what day is it today? Is it the 2nd? Yeah, so in 5 days, probably. 5 to 7 days, the return of the Boomer Zoomer podcast will be happening. And then Grounded, a philosophy podcast. I'm still working on getting the right people for that, because I also want to get professors on the podcast. So I'm reaching out to contacts that I know in the philosophical community and trying to find professors. Like, there are certain professors, because the first topic I want to discuss on the podcast is the divide between analytic and continental philosophy, or the supposed divide between the two. And I know a lot of professors who have written very extensively on that subject, and I would love for them to be members on that panel as sort of like the peak authority on the subject, among other people, of course. So that'll be great. And among other people, so Perspective Philosophy will be coming on, Marty will be coming on. There's someone on Twitter who is very well versed in philosophy of science and quantum mechanics and just general physics, who has totally expressed interest in coming on. Goes by the name of Lichtenstein. Super excited to have him on when we do a science topic. So things are really looking up in terms of content for this channel. So I'm super pumped for that. So okay, there are those announcements. Oh, the other thing, people are getting. I need to show myself out a little bit more often. Also, here's also exciting. My YouTube channel, finally getting money. That's right. I'll show you the graph. Do you want to see? Oh my, you're not going to believe this. Like, I thought, as someone in philosophy, I wouldn't be able to make money. And I never thought I'd be able to make the money that I'm now currently making. It's pretty cool, actually. So check it out. Yeah, so as you can see here, I'm just rolling in the dough now, and it's all thanks to you guys, really, that I've been able to come so far from where I began now. So thank you guys so much for supporting my YouTube channel and allowing me to really make it big on YouTube using AdSense. So thanks so much for that. Yeah, so if you want to support me, the best way to support me is by hitting the donate button down below, and then you'll do text to speech, and you get to hear the amazing Quebecois accent with whatever message you want to send. Or also, if you have Twitch Prime, sub using Twitch Prime, or just sub normally on Twitch. That is definitely the the best way to support me. Okay, I think that is everything. I think that's everything. To get out the way. Oh, okay, wait. One other thing. I get a lot of people. Look, what I do on Twitter is not the same thing that I do on my Twitch stream. So if I call people on Twitter, that doesn't mean that it's going to translate over into my Twitch. My Twitch streams and my YouTube channel are devoted to educational content and talking with people who are in good faith, who are educated on the topics being discussed. And so I'm not just going to talk to anyone who has an issue with something that I've said. I've said that before. I'm going to stand by that. I've made the mistake before about talking to people who are uneducated or are arguing in bad faith, and I don't plan to make that mistake again. Call me out on it if you see me doing it again. So, people messaging me saying, hey, no, you got to debate this. Oh my God, you're being such a coward for not, following through on debating it. I mean, I've said before, like, this is just, it's not a thing of convenience. You've seen me go on many different people's streams before and debate them on, moral grounding or whatever. So it's not like I'm incapable of having that discussion. It's that I don't see a lot of use coming from that. And so I'm not going to continue doing that. So there's that. Okay. Fine. Finally, we can really get to philosophy of mind, Cartesian dualism, which sounds very, very spooky, doesn't it? It sounds very outdated. You might think, oh, gosh, this is the stuff that religious fanatics believe in. There's no one possibly competent that actually believes in any form of Cartesian dualism, right? Oh, yeah, like, Nashi, it sounds boring, right? Actually, I think it's probably the least boring of all the philosophy of mind theories. Cartesian dualism, at its base, essentially says there are two types of substances in the universe. There's the physical substance of the world. So physical objects, this cup, the water in my cup, the monitor, my hand, etc. But there's also...
Carnist mad.
Very true. They are mad. Thank you again, Carlos. And then there's the mental substance that also is supposed to pervade the universe. And the mental substance is simply the realm where our mental thoughts and mental states and our consciousness are located. So these are two separate substances, different. They have different properties, and they are not essentially the same, because there's a tendency, especially in science and neuroscience, to reduce everything mental to the physical. So when we talk about a mind state, like philosophy, or like pain states or something in philosophy of mind, there's a tendency to just reduce a pain state, like when I get pricked in the hand and I feel a sensation of pain, there's a tendency to reduce that down to some sort of neural state in the brain. But Cartesian dualism says, well, no, actually, that isn't something that's going on in the brain. That is something going on in your Cartesian ego. That is occurring in a different substance, namely the mental substance. Now, you can probably imagine why a lot of people now completely dismiss this type of position. It sounds like bullshit, right? It's very reminiscent of people of the idea of the existence of God, because it doesn't fit in with our modern, scientific, naturalistic worldview. And by naturalistic, we quite literally mean that everything can ultimately be reduced down to something that is purely physical and can be investigated by the tools of science. So the naturalistic tendency arose essentially in the early 20th century as a reaction against hyper-idealism by people like Hegel and the late German idealists, essentially claiming that a lot of the metaphysics that's going on in philosophy, talking about, absolute idealism, the world spirit, etc., these are all things that really don't have any meaning. They are just silly postulates that don't have any actual connection to the world. While something like science and physics and chemistry and biology, these are all things that we can empirically see and empirically investigate. And so the meaning of our mental states needs to be reduced down to something that is able to be empirically investigated. Because how do we empirically investigate the idea of a Cartesian ego? These are things that are supposedly purely private matters. They are purely internal to us. There's no way for me to go and investigate the Cartesian ego, the consciousness of someone who isn't myself. I can't go up to my friend and try to investigate their mental states. That's something that is purely private to them. But if we take the position, the naturalistic position, that mental states are actually something physical, well, then all of a sudden, these mental states are no longer purely private, but they are able to be accessed publicly, and we can understand them publicly. So that was really the prevailing notion that toppled the predominant view in the philosophy of mind, that there are these two types of substances, and they interact with one another in a certain way. Well, no, people went away with that, and they went for a purely monistic position, meaning there's only one substance, and the substance, of course, that they appealed to was a physical substance. Now, what replaced Cartesian dualism? Well, if you watched my last stream about philosophy of mind, and if you missed that, you can look at the YouTube channel where I talk about it. If you missed the last discussion, I went through some of these prevailing positions that exist in the philosophy of mind, and immediately following the downfall of Cartesian dualism, or a form of substance dualism. Substance dualism is probably the more correct word, because Cartesian dualism is a specific type of substance dualism, relating specifically to René Descartes' version of substance dualism, but I'm just going to sort of use them interchangeably here. If you watched my last video, I talked about behaviorism, and Build the Wall 2016, interesting name, You bring up, you say here, yes, you can ask them how they're feeling. It's pretty easy to investigate someone's mental state. Well, what you're talking about right there is the exact approach that the behaviorist school in the philosophy of mind took. They said, okay, well, look, we have to admit that we can't delve into someone's private life. And that actually any talk of mental states is simply going to reduce down to something like behavioral dispositions. So when I say that someone is in a state of pain, they have a mental state of feeling pain, what that's just code for is essentially saying, well, they are in a certain physical disposition where they will exhibit certain traits that we associate with pain, like wincing and going, and grimacing and yelling out in pain, right? So when I get pricked in the hand, and I say, oh, I'm in pain, what that's signifying is, oh, I'm in a current psychological disposition such that I will grimace and I will wince and I will cry. Okay? There's nothing beyond that. All that there is to mental states are the behaviors that are associated with mental states. And so this is a pure reduction of the mental, the supposed Cartesian other substance, to something that is purely physical, because behavioral dispositions and behaviors are clearly something that are observable publicly and are purely physical. So we go away from this private inner Cartesian substance and instead reduce all of that down to something that is publicly observable and is purely physical. Now, behaviorism has its own problems, and again, I talked about these, and I won't go over it again. I talked about these in my previous stream on the philosophy of mind. And again, you can look at the YouTube channel for that. But behaviorism faced a lot of issues, and so people began abandoning it in droves. And as of now, I don't know of any behaviorists in the field of philosophy of mind because there are just too many problems associated with it. And instead, people appeal to the psychoneural identity thesis, also called the mind-brain identity thesis. There are many names for it. The idea is essentially that for every type of mental state that I have, for example, a pain state, that is purely identical to a specific type of physical brain state. So when I talk about pain states, I'm just actually talking about a certain type of state that my brain is in. There's a certain type of arrangement of brain matter and neurons that always correspond to a state of pain. And it doesn't just apply to pain, it also applies to beliefs. It applies to certain dispositions like being fearful of something, etc. Now, this was very popular for a very long time, advocated for by people like Plass and maybe it's Place. I think it's Plass, J.J.C. Smart, David Lewis, etc. Now, that suffered, as I said in the last video, you can go check that out on YouTube. It also suffered a major downfall because of arguments from Hilary Putnam as well as Jerry Fodor using the multiple realizability argument. Again, I talked about this in the last video, so go check that out. So people abandoned it. And then people moved on to other forms of materialism and physicalism, this monistic, naturalistic stance to the mind where everything is purely physical. And people adopted something like functionalism, where the mind is simply corresponds to a certain functional organism that a human being has, or perhaps a robot would have. So you have a lot of investigation into artificial intelligence in that area. You have people who are token physicalists who will say, well, the type of mental state that someone has isn't always corresponding to a type of brain state because of the multiple realizability argument, but we can still say that for every single instance of a mind state, we can always reduce that to a single instance of a brain state. I'll talk about that on another stream. But you basically had all of these different takes on physicalism, and it seemed that more and more and more, there were all of these issues that materialism, that was once thought able to conquer all the problems that dualism faced, all of a sudden materialism and these naturalistic approaches to the mind are facing a whole host of issues. And so in the last 15 years or so, there has been a major resurgence in the philosophy of mind towards a dualistic view of the mind. That doesn't necessarily posit more than one type of substance, but recognizes that there's something intrinsically different about mind states that don't operate in the same way as physical states or brain states. So there's my little preface, my little historical preface about the development of the mind, and how it has played out in the philosophy of mind over the past, I guess, century. And if anyone has questions, and again, a lot of those details, you're not going to understand everything I just said, but a lot of that stuff I talked about in my last stream about philosophy of mind, and I really encourage people to go check that out. We talked about behaviorism, functionalism, psychoneural identity theory, and as well as a bit about dualism as well. So, if you're curious about that, go check that out. But I want to draw specifically on a paper, ironically enough, by Lycan, Lycan, which is quite funny given the circumstances, by William G Lycan, who is a very famous philosopher of language. In particular, he wrote a leading textbook in the philosophy of language, but he's also quite famous now in philosophy of mind. And he has been an extremely staunch supporter of materialism in the philosophy of mind. His belief in materialism has never wavered. However, in 2009, he wrote a paper called Giving Dualism Its Due. And I'll take this as sort of the starting point for our discussion, and we'll sort of go, because I think it's an excellent summary of the problems that materialism currently faces, as well as some possible approaches that can be taken to develop a dualist approach to the mind that is still coherent and still makes sense. So, if you want to read this, it was published in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, volume 87, number 4, page 551 to 563 in December 2009. And I'm going to read briefly his very introduction to it, okay? So here we go. I've been a materialist about the mind for 40 years, since first I considered the mind-body issue. In all that time, I've seen exactly one argument for mind-body dualism that I thought even prima facie convincing. And like many other materialists, I've often quickly cited standard objections to dualism that are widely taken to be fatal. For example, notoriously the dread interaction problem, which we will discuss. My materialism has never wavered, nor is it about to waver now. I cannot take dualism very seriously. Being a philosopher, of course I would like to think my stance is rational, held not just instinctively and scientifically, and in the mainstream, but because the arguments do indeed favor materialism over dualism. But I do not think that, though I used to. My position may be rational, broadly speaking, but not because the arguments favor it. Though the arguments for dualism do indeed fail, so do the arguments for materialism. And the standard objections to dualism are not very convincing. If one really manages to be a dualist in the first place, one should not be much impressed by them. My purpose in this paper is to hold my own feet to the fire and admit that I do not proportion my belief to the evidence. So, the essence of the paper will be Lycan examining some of the most popular objections to dualism, or specifically Cartesian dualism, and examining how these objections that have been utilized over the past century against dualism are not actually as strong as people seem to make them. Because in a standard philosophy of mind textbook, going 30 years back, Cartesian dualism would barely be discussed. It would be immediately dismissed on the basis of a problem like the interaction problem. And so let's go through some of these some of these problems that are supposed to show that Cartesian dualism is a ridiculous stance and shouldn't really be considered in any serious capacity. So the first problem that people will point to for Cartesian dualism, talked about this in my last stream, is the dreaded interaction problem. And you can probably already figure out based on that what that is. So if you're a Cartesian dualist, it means you believe that there exists two types of substances. Actually, the whiteboard app isn't working for me right now. I'll try to get it fixed for next stream, though. If you're a Cartesian dualist, there exist two types of substances in the world. There's the material substance and the mental substance. The mental substance consists of all of those mind states that we are able to readily, observe in our mind that don't seem to be located anywhere in the physical world. And the question that the materialist or naturalist will pose to the Cartesian dualist is this. In the physical world, we readily observe instances of physical interaction. So when I pick up my cup and I drop it, there is a clear causal chain that links my cup to my hand, and I can clearly track that. That's a clear instance where I have done something with my hand, I've hit another object, and it's moved. I can clearly track the interaction that occurs in the physical world. But if there are two types of substances, and we want to say that the mental does interact with the physical, the question is, what does this interaction consist in? You might question, first of all, well, why do we even need to say that the physical interacts with the mental? Well, just consider an obvious case where I prick my hand and I feel a moment of pain. The Cartesian dualist wants to say, well, when I prick my hand in the physical world, that causes the mental state of pain. So there is an interaction from the physical world with the mental world, in that my physical action of piercing my skin, it travels up my arm, affects my nerves, and generates perhaps a certain brain state, but this then it interacts with my mental disposition to cause me to experience the mental state of pain. So there are clearly all these instances of mental-physical interaction that need to be accounted for. And it doesn't just go from the physical to the mental. We also want to say that when I pick up my cup, it is because I desire to do so. And desire is, again, a type of mental state. And so this mental state has to somehow make its way into the physical world such that my arm literally does pick up my cup. So it goes both ways, and these are cases of mental-physical interaction, and it's not clear how we can make sense of this. And Descartes' original answer to this was to posit a physical location in the brain called the pineal gland that is the supposed connection between the mental and physical substances. And it is here that everything physical in the body travels up to and then causes a mental state. Now, of course, with modern science, we know that doesn't make any sense, and it's just sort of an ad hoc explanation that can easily be dismissed. There are some other explanations. You can completely deny the idea of mental-physical interaction, for instance. You can readily say that, actually, when I do pierce my skin, that doesn't cause anything in my mind. Instead, we can follow someone like Leibniz, who believed in the idea of divine, what's the word for it? The clockmaker, where essentially at the first instance where the universe was created, pre-established harmony. Thank you very much, Bill DeWall. We can believe in the idea of pre-established harmony, where at the moment of conception of the universe, God created the mental substance and the physical substance such that there would be these correlations between the mental world and the physical world. So that when I pierce my skin and cause, or what I think causes a mental state, there's no causation going on at all. It just so happens that God has made it so that there's always that correlation in the mental state that will correspond to the physical state. But there's no interaction between the two. Now, you can obviously see the issue with this, namely that it posits the existence of God, which people don't want to do in philosophy. Most philosophers are pretty staunch atheists. And even if you are a theist, for example, it is going to be hard for you to argue in a non-ad hoc way that pre-established harmony is a legitimate possibility in the first place. Like, why would God necessarily do that? Why wouldn't he just make it so that there is this interaction between a mind and body? If he is an omnipotent being, why would he make a world where, well, why would he make things so overly complicated? It seems far more easier just to allow for mental physical causation. So, there's that answer, which we can largely just dismiss. So the question is, what do we do? And Lycan talks about the interaction problem, and he points to the fact that as it stands right now, there is really no theory for mental physical causation, and I certainly don't know of any. There's no clear there's no explanation I can give for you as to how the physical interacts with the mental or vice versa. So why is it that we should suppose that there's any sort of interaction in the first place? This seems to be a complete defeater for dualism, which necessitates the idea of mental physical interaction. Well, Lycan actually brings up a very, very interesting point, and it is this. Remember at the start of when I was talking about the interaction problem, I talked about physical causation, because we want to say, or the materialists want to say, or the naturalists want to say, that unlike the physical world, we can't describe a theory of interaction between the physical and the mental. But we can do that in the physical world through an explanation of physical causation. Well, it's a really interesting point that that Lycan brings up, namely that for most of, I guess for about 500 years, 300 to 400 years, most philosophers, or empirical philosophers, didn't even believe in the idea of causation in the first place. They believed in a Humean theory of causation. And this is referencing the philosopher David Hume, who was a very famous British empiricist, part of the early modern movement, who was responding to people like Descartes and Leibniz. And so he developed a purely empirical theory about the world. And he said that the idea of causation is, actually, yes, you're right. Sorry, he's not British. He was Scottish, not British. My bad. He went to the University of Edinburgh. He essentially said this idea of causation in the world is purely illusory. There isn't causation. We can never have a type of certainty that one thing will cause another. All that we have are psychological observations of different correlations, such that when I associate one event with another, I might conveniently say that this caused that, but that's just a psychological product of the way that I have observed the world to be. So when the sun rises in the morning, and I see that the birds, come out and start tweeting, I can't actually describe that as a legitimate form of causation. It is not true that there exists a causal link between the sun in the sky and then the birds on the earth causing them to, tweet and being really annoying and waking me up in the morning. I can't say that. It's just a psychological convenience that I posited. And it probably even makes more sense in the case of laws, because there's a Humean theory of laws, where when I say that it is a law that when I drop an object, it's going to go towards the center of the earth due to the law of gravitation, the Humean theory of law says, well, there's no actual law in the world. It's just a convenience that we've posited because we've seen the association of things falling to the center of the earth so many times before. But because of the nature of empirical investigation, which is something purely inductive as opposed to deductive, we can never know for certain that the next time I drop my cup, it will fall towards the center of the earth. And so deduction is something that is going to be necessarily true by very definition. So when I say, for example, all bachelors are married men, all bachelors are not married men, and I say Socrates is a bachelor, then it necessarily follows that Socrates is not a married man. Okay? That holds regardless of what the world is like. That is just simply deductively the case. But inductive cases are cases that rely on the empirical content of the world to be true. So when I say that all ravens are black, I am making a statement not about all the things that I have observed up to this point, but about all future instances that I could possibly observe in the future. So it might be the case that up until now, I have seen that all ravens are black, but there is nothing stopping the world from simply producing a raven that is white. There is nothing deductively impossible about that. It is just simply that up until this point, probabilistically, it seems that that's unlikely, but we can't rule out the possibility of that happening in the first place. And in the same way, when we talk about the law of gravitation, it might be that up until this very point, every single thing that we have done has obeyed the law of gravitation in all of our observations. But deductively and purely logically, there is nothing stopping us from seeing an instance where all of a sudden my cup just floats upward and the laws of gravity just suddenly change. And you might have objections to this. You might say, well, actually, no, we can be certain of that. And there are many attempts to do so. And actually, I'm quite inclined to agree with them. But you can at least understand what Hume is getting at here. And so all of a sudden, these laws of nature are not things out there that are in the world. They are just convenient psychological tools that we do to live our lives. And so there's nothing necessary about these laws in the world. They are just purely things of habit that we have as human beings incorporated into our daily lives. And the same thing goes for causation. When I say that one thing causes another, I don't really mean that there's a causal connection between these two things. I'm just using it as a form of habit and as a form of convenience without committing myself to there actually being a type of causation in the world. And so, again, for the most part in the history of philosophy, empiricists were Humeans about causation. They were anti-realists about causation. They said that actual causation, as we typically mean, doesn't occur in the world. And it's very odd that these same people that are attacking the dualist theory for not being able to provide a thesis about the interaction between the mental and the physical are people who don't believe in the existence of causation in the physical world in the first place. So Lycan points out this very hypocritical attitude that these early empiricists in the early 20th century took to the idea of philosophy of mind and tried to dismiss a theory, because this was their go-to objection, this interaction problem. They wanted to dismiss it on the grounds that it can't make sense of causation between the physical and the mental, even though their own theory of causation is one that isn't real in the first place. They themselves cannot provide a theory of causation that doesn't boil down to just psychological habits. And if they are just saying that physical causation is psychological habits, then why can I not say that physical events causing mental events is also just psychological habit? So the argument doesn't say anything against dualism anymore if you are going to project the notion of real causation in the first place. Does that make sense? I know that's a bit confusing. I had to go into human stuff and talk about deductive and inductive logic, but hopefully that makes at least a bit of sense. If you need me to repeat something or explain something maybe a bit better, please let me know and I will do my best. Can I give examples of what specifically? Not a very convincing. Well, we're not talking about veganism. Once more. Oh boy. I can't do the whole thing again. But basically, the people who attack dualism on the basis that it can't make sense of how physical things cause mental things are the same people who deny in the first place that physical things can cause other physical things to happen. So they are anti-realists about causation in the physical world, but somehow want the dualist to provide a realist account of causation for mental things causing physical things. And so they try to have it both ways. Well, if they were actually being consistent in their worldviews, they would be anti-realists both about causation in the physical world and about causation in relation to mental, physical causation. So hopefully that makes a bit more stuff. I think the natural law stuff is really interesting. I'd love to see more about that. Yeah, I'd love to do like a physical or a philosophy roundtable on the topic of natural laws. I have Milo, I have a YouTube video from a few days ago, or I think a week ago, where I talk about natural laws and specifically a philosopher of science named Nancy Cartwright, who believes that the fundamental laws of physics are lies. And I talk about that and provide some objections to that on my YouTube channel if you're interested in that topic. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so there's one possible response, but ultimately that's not enough, because starting in 1973, David Lewis published a paper called Causation, and he developed a completely new account of causation, namely the counterfactual account of causation. Now, I can't possibly sit here and give to you an in-depth, detailed explanation of David Lewis's account of causation because it is overly complex, incredibly complex. I would say that paper is extremely difficult for people to understand and wrap their heads around because it relies on understanding parts of ontology, and it relies on you understanding not just first-order logic, but also modal logic, and also having a background in causation in the first place. The best I can really do is to say that he views causation as a theory about counterfactuals. So when I say that one thing causes another, what I'm actually saying is that if the first thing didn't happen, then the second thing would not have happened. That is the most bare bones explanation of Lewis's account of causation that I can give. A counterfactual is a statement like, if X hadn't occurred, then Y wouldn't have occurred. So if I say, if Quebec had voted in the 1998 referendum, 51-49 to leave Canada, then Quebec would no longer be part of Canada. That's a counterfactual statement. And we evaluate the truth of that statement based on what Lewis will call possible worlds. Yes, there's the paper. Thanks so much, Empirics. And the truth of that statement depends on, we evaluate all the possible worlds, and this is where it gets confusing, because David Lewis legitimately thinks that among our actual existing world, there exists, I don't know how many other possible worlds that are actually ontologically existing out there. He is what is called a modal realist. I've already said a bit too much, that's too confusing. But suffice to say, for this discussion, all that you really need to know is that this account of causation is no longer Humean. It is a type of realism about causation. Although I think Lycan says that it is... I think he says that it is Semi-realist, yes, but they are semi-Humean, requiring only specific forms of counterfactual dependence. So there you go. But the point is that there are current accounts of, could this type of thinking tie into many worlds quantum mechanics? Not really. No, so people want to connect Lewis, or understand Lewis's modal realism from a scientific standpoint. The reality is that the motivations for the two are just incredibly different, and Lewis's modal realism doesn't come at all or stem at all from any investigation into science. It is a purely philosophical argument. I don't know if you could draw connections there, but as far as I know, that's not really a type of overlap for him. And try not to interpret Lewis's modal realism in terms of many world quantum mechanical theories. So suffice to say, there exist now causation or theories of causation about the physical world that are realist. So that when I do drop a cup and it falls on the ground, I will say that me dropping the cup is what caused it to fall on the ground, and that is an actual thing that exists in the world. It's not, like Hume claimed, just a psychological habit. So if someone is a realist about causation now, about the physical world, it seems legitimate for them to level an objection against the Cartesian dualist that you also must provide an explanation about causation between the physical world and the mental world. So there you go. Now, Lycan does something kind of interesting here, which I had never really considered. He wants to say that perhaps mind-body interaction is only probabilistic. Now, I'm not entirely sure how that solves the problem. It's only in one little paragraph that he mentions this. I don't know how that solves the problem, because surely if we have a probabilistic about causation, we still have something more to the model than just saying it's probabilistic, right? When I say it's probable that when I drop a cup, it's going to land on the ground, or that it's probable that when, what's a good example? It's probable that when I roll a die, it's going to land on, it's an even chance for it to land on an even or an odd number. I still need to have sort of a causal chain that exists physically between the act of me rolling the dice and it landing on a certain side. We can attach probabilistic notions to that account of causation, but you still need something more than that. So I'm not entirely sure what he's getting at there, and I think maybe that's me not having a full understanding, but he doesn't elaborate on it at all. So if anyone has any idea of what he means by that, please let me know. But the most interesting thing that he suggests is that we completely do away with the idea of the non-spatiality of the Cartesian ego. Now, this is interesting because I haven't specifically mentioned this, but underlying this whole discussion of causation, the problem between the interaction between the mental world and the physical world is that we track physical causation using temporal spatial relations. So when I say that I tip over a mug, I can draw a bunch of time slices in the spatio-temporal world and directly track at each time where the mug has fallen. So at this time, it's at this angle, this time at this angle, this time at this angle, and I draw a causal link between each of them, right? That's how we track causation in the physical world. But with the mental world, there isn't spatiality. There is only temporality. And by that I mean, when we examine mental states that we have held, we can track them based on time, right? This morning, I might have believed that it was going to rain today. And I can track that in my mind. Okay, I believed that, 5 hours ago, right? But where do I place that thought in space? Now, as a Cartesian dualist, I don't want to try to say that it exists in the brain, because at that point you start to be giving, I think, a little bit too much to you give a little bit too much to the naturalist. And the immediate reason why a lot of these dualists don't want to do that is because they believe that the mind is something, like Plato argued, the mind is something that will persist even after death. And that's why there was a lot of appeals to religion in these types of discussions about dualism, because a lot of the reason why people become dualists in philosophy are because people are religious. And people want to believe that the soul, after material death, will then go on and, go to heaven or something. But we can't really make sense of that in a coherent way if we treat the mind as something that is spatial. Now, what Lycan suggests is that we do away with the idea of non-spatiality. And we actually treat the mind as something that is spatial, but still not something that is physical. And he doesn't say a lot about this. Again, only does it in a little part of a paragraph, but he responds to two potential objections to it, where, first of all, he says, when we talk about something being physical, we can't have two different things occupy the exact same region of space, right? My mug can't occupy the same physical region as my brain, right? Only one thing occupies a given place at a time. And he agrees with that, but he says that that only applies to physical things. So even if we admit that the Cartesian ego, and if I haven't defined Cartesian ego yet, that's just sort of the seat of the soul, the seat of our consciousness. If we admit that it's not physical and we still say that it is mental, then we don't run into that problem, because all that, sort of this this exclusion principle says is that two physical things can't occupy the same region of space. But there's nothing that contradicts the idea that a mental thing and a physical thing can occupy the same region of space. So that's his response to that. And he also says, and this is weird, our heads are not entirely full of physical stuff. Physically, they are mostly empty space, with minuscule particles zipping through them at very high speeds. I don't totally understand why you need to say that if you are also trying to say that the physical and the mental don't run into that exclusion problem, where the mental and the physical can occupy the same region. Why do you then need to say that physically it doesn't actually occupy all of space? I guess it's sort of like a way out, just in case. Just in case you want to say that the mental and the physical can't overlap in space, you could then say, well, perhaps the mind, the Cartesian ego, occupies that region of space wherever there aren't physical particles, which is true, right? The void where there don't exist any particles, there's more of that than there are the particles, of course. And I guess the argument would perhaps then be that that is where the mind is located. But it's a bit of a weird thing to say, I think. But essentially he wants to say, well, let's go away with the spatiality of space, or go away with the non-spatiality of mind. Sorry, I don't know why I said the spatiality of space. And we'll say that the mind, the Cartesian ego, is located, minds are located where it feels as if they are located in the head behind the eyes. So that is what he says. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because we now are able to completely sidestep the interaction problem. Because if minds, Cartesian egos, are things that are located in space, we are then able to track them in the spatio-temporal world and can provide, just like physical causation, a causal account of the interaction between mental things and physical things. Because we can directly draw, if we know that the mind occupies a certain mental region, then we can clearly draw a causal link between something in the physical world to something in the mental world. Because the problem initially with the interaction problem is that people were arguing that the mind doesn't occupy physical space. And so we can't provide the link between something that is spatial and something that is non-spatial. But if we do away with the idea that the mind has to be non-spatial, and we admit that it can be located in space, well, all of a sudden we can draw those necessary causal links to one another. And so, based on this, Lycan thinks that the dualist can do away with the largest problem that faces Cartesian dualism, namely that interaction problem. How does the mind follow your physical body then? That's a great question. That's another objection that we will I think I'll address that later on in the stream. But the objection that you're getting at is, well, why exactly is my mind always tethered to my head being behind my eyes? That's a great question, and we will get to that. Don't worry. Okay. I'm going to show myself out again. If you're enjoying this stream, enjoying what you're hearing, and want to support this project of bringing philosophy to Twitch, which currently doesn't exist, you can hit the donate button down below and help me earn minimum wage, which is the goal, you see. My goal is to earn minimum wage every hour. You can also subscribe. If you have Twitch Prime, you get a free subscription every month, and you can subscribe using that, etc., etc. Yeah, I'd really appreciate it, so I can earn minimum wage. Hey, thanks so much, and I'll go through the follows right here. And thank you again, Carlos, for those donations earlier. Thank you, Eternal Sunshine, Empirix RM, Illegal Water, Camphor Peach, 0am4r, and Scene Loitering, all for following. Hey, and thank you so much, Empirix RM, for subscribing with the Twitch Prime. Did that not come up on the screen? Okay, I maybe it did, but I replayed it anyway, so you can see the animation of the cell splitting. By the way, yeah, that's supposed to be like a cell, because people who are supporters of me for some reason started calling themselves REM cells. So it's supposed to be a cell undergoing mitosis. Hey, and thank you so much, M8A7. There we go. Look, we are 3/15 of the way towards earning minimum wage. How fantastic. Round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Round of applause. Yeah, poggers. That's right. Poggers in the chat. Okay. Before we go on, let me check one thing here. Okay, perfect. We are ready to keep going. Yeah, so wait, does anyone here have... Let's do a quick question, 5-minute question section. Rem, what do you see as the consequences of dualism versus physicalism or similar? Well, I mean, there's a ton of consequences, actually. Oh, Straws of Pretty. Thank you so much for the $5 donation. I really appreciate it. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Yay! I never know how to respond to donations, but thank you. I genuinely really appreciate it. Thank you very much. What do you... Ooh, that's a nice emote. Look at that rose. Oh, DSA. Yes. Dem Socias unite. Let's go. Okay, so consequences of dualism versus physicalism. I mean, there are so many that I'm not totally sure where to begin. But if I can think of off the top of my head... first of all, and most broadly speaking, it would mean a complete collapse in the predominant view, both in philosophy but also the sciences. And it would then seem that the field of neuroscience is no longer doing what neuroscientists think they are doing, because we are acknowledging that there exists something in the world that is not able to be investigated by physics. So we can no longer believe in this unitary theory of science where everything in the world is capable of being reduced to the basic entities and laws of science. Instead, we have something in the world that is completely unlike anything else. And if all of a sudden there was just this groundbreaking proof of dualism, right, there would be complete restructuring, I think, of the scientific disciplines, and there would be a huge resurgence in psychology towards investigating. Like, I think you'd see a huge resurgence in something like psychoanalysis or Freudian approaches to the mind, which does posit something that is non-physical, as opposed to the now predominant views in psychology, I think, that everything is basically built up of physico-chemical states. So, there you go. Do you have a specific position on the mind other than not being a physicalist? I'm quite privy to dualistic naturalism. So this is my issue. This is my own. I'll do this for. I'll probably have a whole stream on this, but my biggest issue with the idea that the mental can be something purely physical is that there's certain conceptions about the mental that don't at all square with our conceptions about the physical. So, for example, with our thoughts and our beliefs and the things that we take to be true, these things all have a normative component to them. When I tell someone, you ought to believe this, you ought to believe that, you can't, it's not, you ought not have a set of incoherent beliefs with one another. There's a sort of normative structure to the mental that consists in reasons for doing things that can't at all be placed on the physical world. We can't tell the physical world that it ought to be like this, or that it ought to be structured according to this. It just purely is the way that it is. But with the mental world, there's this entire normative component that doesn't seem to be able to be translated into the physical world. And I mean, this sort of overlaps, I think, a bit with the is-ought problem, that if we acknowledge that there are certain duties that we ought to perform, then we don't derive those from the way that things are. And it's similar in that respect, in that there are certain ways that our mind are structured in this normative conceptual framework that can't be translated onto a purely physical picture of the world. I know that's very broad and might not make... I think Dark and Full of Terrors probably understands at least a bit of what I'm talking about. I'll admit I've not looked into this. Do neurological, psychological disciplines operating under physicalist assumptions not produce positive, consistent results? So I'm not saying that they don't produce positive, consistent results. That's definitely not what I'm saying. It's simply that what they are investigating... Like, we can acknowledge that science can be a fantastic tool, a fantastic predictive tool. But just because something is predictive doesn't necessarily mean that it's the actual true state of the world. If we look at the history of science, for example, the Ptolemaic theory of astronomy versus the Copernican, at the time of when Copernicus wrote, the Ptolemaic model was actually more consistent and more predictive of a tool than the Copernican model, because of the fact that the Copernican model couldn't make sense of the parallaxes, that's what it's called, right, of the stars relative to the position of the Earth. And it was only later on that we were able to make sense of that. So, just substance dualism in particular, but I'm honing specifically in on Cartesian dualism because that's most accessible to people who be. Okay, I'll keep going now. A random thing that you and my epistemology lecturer follow each other, which is neat. Yeah, I've made actually a lot of connections through philosophy Twitter now, which is pretty cool. And it's weird. I think there's a lot of people that I follow and follow me on Twitter that are at my institution, but don't necessarily know that they don't connect my Twitter account with me, in IRL world, which is a bit odd. And I sometimes wonder, is me ranting about lobsters gonna make me look weird to people in the field? But whatever. I'll do what I think is right. Hi, thanks, Destrani. Hello, Destrani. Okay, let's keep going then. So that is the Stroza Preti. There you go. There's my perhaps slightly racist, I don't know, Italian accent, but I did what you requested. You also gave me $5, so there you go. There we go. Yeah, no problem. Okay, so we talked about the interaction problem and the way that Lycan thinks the dualist can respond to it, but the interaction problem is certainly not going to be the only problem that the dualist faces. And so the way that Lycan approaches this in this paper is he considers a bunch of other objections that the dualist will then have to face. So he gives 8 further problems. He gives 8 further problems that the dualist has to face, and he provides explanations for why these objections are not actually as strong as you might think they would be. So I'll go through them in order. The first one is excrescencehood, which is basically that... Oh, Stroza Preti, thank you so much for another $5. I guess that's what I get for doing an Italian accent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Excrescencehood is essentially saying that Cartesian minds, Cartesian egos, our consciousness are queer things that exist in the world. Queer in like the literal sense that it's so unlike everything else that we essentially, they are simply not capable of explaining things in the way that physical things are capable of explaining. The next objection is that the Cartesian ego, the Cartesian mind, doesn't obey the laws of physics, namely the conservation laws regarding linear momentum and matter energy. That's the second objection. The third objection is that there's no way for us to make sense of the development of the Cartesian ego in relation to our current evolutionary theory, namely because it doesn't seem like Cartesian egos or Cartesian minds or consciousness can be adaptive in the way that physical things are adaptive. And then Lycan addresses some of Churchland's objections to dualism. And Churchland, I think there's Paul and Patricia Churchman. I think he's specifically talking about Paul Churchland here. But they are probably the 2 most famous physicalists in the field of philosophy. They are hardcore physicalists, and they advocate something called eliminative materialism, which is sort of a complete nihilism about the mental. So we just dismiss outright the idea of anything mental in the first place, and everything is ultimately just going to be... There's not even reduction going on. It is just simply the fact that everything that exists is purely physical and these base particles of our physical theories. And he addresses some of Churchland's objections, namely explanatory impotence. Neuroscience explains a great deal, and dualism explains hardly nothing. Next objection, neural dependence. This is the quote from Churchland. If there really is a distinct entity in which reasoning, emotion, and consciousness takes place, and if that entity is dependent on the brain for nothing more than sensory experiences as input and volitional executions as output, then one would expect reason, emotion, and consciousness to be relatively invulnerable to direct control or pathology by manipulation or damage to the brain. But in fact, the exact opposite is true. The next 3 more objections here, and we'll go through each of them. Epistemology of other minds. Cartesian egos were non-spatial, which means their epistemology seems utterly hopeless. Unity and individuation. Cartesian dualism is interactionist. The contents of a Cartesian mind are contents of that mind in virtue of its exclusive causal connections to the relevant human body. And someone mentioned this earlier, why is it that my mind always tracks my body? Why can't my mind just go to someone else's body? I think it might have been Build the Wall who brought that up earlier. Someone brought that up earlier, but there's that objection. And then finally, Jaegwon Kim's pairing problem. And I talked about that before, but we'll go into that again. So let's sort of try to address each of these. So the first thing that we should talk about is what Lycan calls excrescencehood, which is a really weird term that I'd never actually come across until now. But you can just think of it like, well, mental states are extremely queer. And by queer, we mean they don't seem to serve the same purpose that all other states in the world function as. Cartesian minds are not something that can be served as a sort of explanatory tool in the way that a physical state could be. So we posit, for example, the existence of electrons because of the phenomena that we observe in the world, right? So when I rub a piece of wool against, a piece of metal, and then I touch something metal, I will then, produce a static shock. And because of these phenomena, we posit the existence of electrons and the transference of electrons from one body to another as an explanation for that phenomena. But in the view of the Cartesian minds, they don't see that they can be explanatory posits at all, because these are things that are purely known from our own inner lives. When I think about the Cartesian mind, I'm not positing it because it's being used to explain something. I'm positing it just because it seems to be there. And that is supposed to be something very different than all of our other theories about the world. All of our other scientific theories posit entities because they are supposedly able to explain the world and explain why certain phenomena happen. But because of the nature of mental substance, these are things that are purely internal to us. And so the reason for positing them is completely unlike anything else in science. And I think this is just such a ridiculous objection on multiple fronts. First of all, who cares? Why does everything need to be explanatory? Like, let's even say that explanatory explanations for entities are a good thing. That's fine and all. But why should that exclude the positing of entities that aren't necessarily explanatory? And even further, why can't it be explanatory in a certain way? If we want to say that I move my cup in this certain fashion, I can posit the existence of the Cartesian mind to explain why I've moved this cup. That is a direct explanation of why this occurred by appealing to a mental state that I had in the Cartesian mind to explain why now there's a physical change in the world, because I willed it to happen, and that came from the seat of the soul, from the Cartesian mind. So I think this objection fails, first of all, because I think Cartesian minds can explain things in the way that science explains things. Two, even if it can explain things, why is it that an explanation is the only thing that ultimately matters when we posit the existence of different entities? And I think even worse, and people might disagree with me on this, I don't ultimately think that science is in the role of explaining anything. And this is very controversial, and I'm not going to go into it too much, but I've talked about this many times before. I view science as something that is a purely predictive tool. I'm an instrumentalist about science. So I think that when scientists posit the existence of entities, it's not that these entities are actually explaining the way that the world is, because there are going to be an infinite number of possible explanations for something being the way that it is. The reason why it's posited is because it allows us to intervene in the world and make predictions about what the world will be like. And these are the only things that ultimately should matter to the scientist, I think. Anything else should just be a means towards the end of instrumental power. Science should be used as a tool towards better developing our lives and understanding how the world operates on a predictive level, but not on an explanatory level. So if you agree with me on that, and I know a lot of people won't agree with me on that, and that's fine. I don't want to go into it right now. Instrumental, Straza. So if you disagree with me on that, that's fine. But if you agree with me on that, then you can recognize that this argument also doesn't have any force because the positing of scientific entities doesn't have any explanatory power in the first place. So there you go. That's 3 reasons why I would dismiss this objection. One, because it seems that Cartesian egos can play an explanatory role. 2, because just because certain entities are posited for explanatory roles, why can't something be posited for a non-explanatory role? And 3, I don't think scientific entities are posited for explanatory purposes in the first place. So that would be my response to that specific objection that Lycan considers. That's not how Lycan dismisses it, because in response to that specifically, I'm pretty sure that it's essentially, it can largely be dismissed on the basis of the fact that Cartesian egos are no longer going to be non-spatial for Lycan. If we accept the idea that the Cartesian ego is located behind the eyes in the head, then we no longer run into the issue of explanation, because we can draw a type of explanation in the way that I explain. So in this sense, it's similar, because we can draw a causal link between a place in space where my mental ego is, and draw it to certain physical events in the world. So there you go. And then the next objection was that it doesn't obey the laws of physics. And on this, I can't really comment, because I don't know a ton about advanced classical mechanics and conservation of linear momentum and matter energy. But Lycan just completely dismisses this on the basis that if they are spatial, then they will obey the weak laws of linear momentum and matter energy, and that's ultimately all that is required for physics. So there you go. My own response to that would be something like, well, why do the laws of physics matter? If we want to say that if I want to be an anti-realist in a similar way, if I want to be an instrumentalist and anti-realist with regards to scientific laws, then I no longer run into the issue of something not necessarily being consistent with a law. If a law is posited for instrumental reasons, and I have overriding instrumental reasons to posit something that might potentially violate that law, perhaps that gives me reason to overturn that law and replace it with something different. Because I'm sure that a Cartesian who came along and said, the Cartesian ego exists, to them, that is something that is so clearly intuitive and so clearly correct in the first place that it can't possibly be denied. I mean, we just think. You're thinking right now. You are thinking. We seem to have direct access to this inner private existence that is completely unlike anything else in the physical world. And so from the very get-go, this is going to have an overriding force as opposed to anything to do with theoretical physics, which is something that is so alien and so inaccessible. Someone can live their entire life without ever contemplating, these base quarks and subatomic particles and the way that they relate with one another. But at every single instance of their life, the Cartesian is going to be grappling with their own inner Cartesian ego. So this is something that will have far more explanatory use and more relevance to their life than something like the laws of physics itself. So they could then argue that, well, then maybe the laws of physics need to be amended because here is something that is so clearly true that is enough to override the truth of these basic laws of physics. So there's a possible I don't know if I agree with that objection, but there is a possible response that you could give. The next one was evolutionary theory. I could just rehash my same argument, but it's the instrumentality of science, that evolutionary theory is already in the first place questionable in a certain sense, because how do we reduce that down to something Like, if we want to treat the laws of physics as sort of the base laws, how do we go about translating the laws of biology down to physics? And if we want to say that they can't be reduced, then we run into a whole host of issues. That's something different. But with regards to specifically, with regards to simply to evolution, if we acknowledge, again, that they are physical and are things that are capable of being causally interacting with the world, then it seems quite possible that it could be the product of evolution. And specifically, if we look at Churchland's objection, which Lycan cites here, and says, for purposes of our discussion, the important part about the standard evolutionary story is that the human species in all of its features are the wholly physical outcome of a purely physical process. We are notable in that our nervous system is more complex and powerful than those of our fellow creatures. Our inner nature differs from that of simpler creatures in degree, but not in kind. And this is essentially question begging, because it already presupposes that everything is just the result of a purely physical process. You can't use this as an objection against the Cartesian dualist, because you are already presupposing that Cartesian dualism can't be true in the first place. So the argument, according to Lycan, and I would agree, is completely question begging in the first place. And I think that's enough to just dismiss it on those grounds. Check one thing here. Okay, cool. Anyone have any questions about those three objections so far? Do you think that contradictions are ever actually possible? Probably not. I'm not a dialetheist, so. Constag argument. I think that's that's a question for another time. That's very not related to this discussion. I'll probably talk about it sometime though. Okay. Fine. So the final objections that Lycan considered were explanatory impotence. Dualism competes not with neuroscience, but with materialism as opposing philosophical theory. And I think Lycan brings up a really good point. So this really relies on the fact that we have to recognize that materialism as it stands doesn't really provide any explanations, okay? So the materialist is going to say, well, look, the dualist doesn't seem to be able to explain the type of connections to physical states that neuroscience does. Because neuroscience is able to draw in every single fashion and in every single type of mental state a connection to a physical state, right? So when I go in, according to, this hardcore physicalist view, when I go in to a doctor and I say, oh, I'm really feeling like a lot of pain right now, the idea is that I could potentially undergo a type of investigation whereby a scientist could purely understand my pain states based on the neurophysical makeup of my brain. And in that respect, it's a pure explanation in every single mental state as to why that is occurring. But in the case of a mental state, it seems a lot more loosey-goosey, to use a very strict philosophical term. It doesn't seem like we can draw these strict connections between things happening in the physical world and things happening in the mental world. Like when I experience a brain state, there doesn't seem to be any sort of law-like process that occurs between, me pricking my hand and me experiencing a mental state. Like if I don't prick it enough, it doesn't hurt. If I'm under a certain type of inhibition, it doesn't seem to occur. So the connections between the physical world and the mental world, in terms of their ability to provide explanations as to why certain phenomena occur, are a lot weaker than a purely physicalist theory that is able to reduce absolutely everything down to neuroscience, which is incredibly explanatorily powerful. But if you've been listening to this whole stream, or you caught my last stream about the philosophy of mind, you will remember something here. Namely, that this sort of presupposes the idea that the psychoneural identity thesis, also known as the mind-brain identity theory, is correct. It presupposes in the first place that for every mental state that I have, for every type of mental state that I have, I can always point to a corresponding neuroscientific type of state, right? That's what this is supposing. That's the only way that it's explanatorily powerful, is if the phenomena of the mental are able to be clearly explained by the phenomena of the physical. But if, as has been argued and as most philosophers acknowledge now, that type of reduction simply isn't possible because of arguments like the multiple realizability argument from Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor, then it seems all of a sudden that materialism and physicalism in its weaker sense, which is going to be a type of token physicalism, is actually not really explanatorily powerful and doesn't seem to be any more explanatorily powerful than the dualist theory is going to be. I know that some of that won't make sense to people who didn't catch the last stream, but just know that the type of theory that Churchland is talking about here that would serve to be more explanatorily powerful as the dualist view has basically been proven to be wrong in the philosophy of mind literature, and no one actually believes as of now that type of theory in the philosophy of mind because of stuff like the multiple realizability argument. So on that, once you recognize that, well, all of a sudden that argument no longer works. And if you're curious as to why that theory doesn't work and what the multiple realizability theory is, I really encourage you to check out the video on my YouTube channel where I talk about the multiple realizability argument and the fall of the psychoneural theory, also known as the mind-brain identity theory, and a shift towards a functionalist approach to the philosophy of mind. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense. That's going to be a more confusing explanation. Okay, and let's address now the which one do I want to tackle first? So, another issue that I mentioned was the epistemology of other minds, which is namely, this is the idea that someone, I think, talked about earlier in chat, that, well, if we recognize that a Cartesian ego is something that is purely private and inner, right? These are things that are only accessible to me. I can never have direct access to someone else's mental state. Then how can I really know anything about anyone else's mental states? Well, this argument, I think, fails very clearly, because if we acknowledge that there is this causal interaction between the mental and the physical, then we have to recognize that we can have a type of access to other people's mental states. How do we have access to it? Because we recognize that mental states can causally interact with physical states. So behavior is a physical state or a physical disposition, and this behavior can be directly caused by a mental state. And so we can then draw a causal connection between behavior and an inner mental state. But unlike the behaviorists who were unwilling to commit themselves to anything inner and purely reduce all mental events to a pure language of only behavior, so that when I say that I'm in pain, all I'm saying there is that I'm exhibiting the behavior typically associated with pain, like wincing and groaning and crying, etc., and not going a step further and positing anything that causes that, the dualist is able to provide easy explanations for how we understand the mental states of other minds. We recognize behavior in a person, and we draw the causal link between the behavioral dispositions of people to the corresponding mental states. And the initial objection to this about the interaction between the mental and the physical being impossible, well, we've already addressed that issue because we've dismissed the interaction problem by, as Lycan has argued for, by placing the Cartesian ego in space. So there's that one. And then finally, we talked about, there's two more actually. Someone in chat mentioned earlier, how do we make sense of the fact that essentially, how do we make sense of the fact that my mind is always tethered to my brain? Why is it that when I walk around, my mind, which is located in physical space now, according to Lycan, is always tracking me behind my eyes? Why isn't it going over there? Why isn't it going up there? Why is it following me in an airplane when I am traveling at, extraordinarily fast speeds? And I don't know if I agree here with, I don't think I agree here with Lycan, because he says, quote, "This is indeed an embarrassing question, but the answer is to be found in whatever would explain the appearance of minds in the evolutionary process." And so this objection collapses into the objection based on evolutionary theory. Now, this doesn't sit well with me, because if you reject evolutionary theory and don't use it as an explanatory tool and use it as a purely predictive tool, then the appeal to evolutionary theory in this case is no longer able to be used. And I think this is a legitimate problem for the dualist, because as someone who is a scientific anti-realist, as someone who believes that the laws of science are things that are predictive tools but not explanatory ones, I believe that we can't invoke them to necessarily explain such fundamental facts like why our Cartesian mental state is always tracking with my brain behind my eyes. So I can't invoke the evolutionary theory to solve this problem. I would need to find somewhere else to posit this. And I'm not totally sure what a good response to this would actually be. I think you would have to appeal to something weaker. I think you'd have to become something weaker than Cartesian dualism, and you'd have to argue for a form of emergentism, which is this idea that the mind is something that is produced as a result of the brain, but is still not something that is wholly spatial. But that gets very confusing, and it's unclear exactly how we can explain that without going into evolutionary theory, or without essentially falling back into a form of dualism that relies on the existence of God. Because I could explain why my mind always tracks with me behind my eyes by appealing to the existence of God, right? But I would reject that as someone who doesn't believe in God. And I don't believe that the evolutionary theory explanation works. So I'm sort of left here thinking, well, what can I say about this? Because we don't want to say that the mind is subject to the same laws of physics. That would reduce to absurdity, because it can't be accounted for according to the laws of physics, and I explained that a bit earlier. So I'm not totally sure what to think about this. I don't know if anyone here has any thoughts on that. I'm not sure location is an issue with when mind has no extension. It can be anywhere and everywhere. I think the question is more, why can my brain only control my body? Well, no, so that's not right. If we are working within Lycan's theory here, that the mind is something that is spatial and is located behind the eyes. So maybe you joined a bit later, but that's the theory that we're operating under right now. And the reason we were forced to commit to that and to locate it within a specific section of the world, namely in my head behind the eyes, is because we want to avoid the interaction problem. I'm not sure location is an issue when... Why can my mind only control my... Right, yeah. So I don't think that I don't think that the mind is anywhere and everywhere. I don't think that makes much sense, because even if it is anywhere and everywhere, we acknowledge the existence of other minds. So then I would counter with you, well, why is it that my mind is affecting my body? Oh, the question is, oh, that's exactly what you say. Why can my brain only control why can my mind only control my body? That's exactly right. Right. You totally anticipated my response to that. And that is right. So even if we push the question back a bit by no longer talking about why the mind is tracking the brain, I would then ask, well, why is it that my mind is only capable of affecting my body? Why can't my mind affect someone else's body, or vice versa? And I don't really have a response to this. I've thought about it, and I'm not totally sure, because I don't like the evolutionary appeal. I obviously don't like the appeal to the existence of God. So I think this might be sort of a fatal objection. But, I mean, materialism faces incredible issues as well, right? So I feel like we're sort of, we have to make a pros cons list. So it's very difficult. Do you have a response as to why you're I shouldn't be under the Talos principle anymore right now. I should be under just chatting. Maybe I didn't change that. I thought I changed it to at the start of the stream when Nashi pointed it out. I did stream info. No, yeah, I'm under just chatting. You might need to refresh your screen or your stream right now. That might be why. Oh, you had to refresh. Oh, yeah, no problem. No problem. No problemo. So yeah, I don't know. If anyone has any thoughts on this specifically, has any potential solutions to this. What I'm looking for is an explanation as to why only my mind can affect my body, that doesn't appeal to evolutionary processes, and that doesn't appeal to the existence of God. That's the problem that I have. Okay, so then finally, the final objection is one, I think that came from Yagwan Kim, which is very, very similar, which is essentially that when I say, I mean, this is very similar to the interaction problem, and it's very similar to the problem we just talked about. If I have a billiard ball, and if I have two billiard balls, and I have an 8 ball in front of me, and I hit this left billiard ball, and it hits the 8 ball, I can provide an explanation as to why my left billiard ball doesn't, or my left billiard ball hits the 8 ball, but my right one doesn't. And how do I do that? Well, I just look at the slow physical causal process by which that occurred. I take the time slices, and I can locate at each moment in space-time where the ball was moving and where the right billiard ball was not moving. And the pairing problem essentially says, well, how can I do that with the Cartesian ego? So when I pick up a cup, how can I say, what explanation can I draw for why I moved a cup, but it was me who did it and not someone else? So this is very similar, but just recognize that this problem doesn't arise once we recognize that the mind is located spatially. Which is what Lycan has urged us to do at the start of this paper. Because all of a sudden, interaction between the mind and the physical world is now possible, so we don't have to face this objection. But it does then fall back into the question, well, why is it that it's my mind interacting with this versus someone else's mind? So it falls more back into, well, why is my mind located behind my eyes but not someone else's? Okay, those are all the objections that Lycan has seriously responded to in this paper. And I think it's compelling. I think it's strong in some areas. I think it's weaker in others. I still don't know how I feel about treating the mind as something that is inherently spatial. That's it seems a little bit ad hoc to me, and I think really that's what the problem is going to boil down to is, well, why? Why is the mind behind my eyes? And I don't think the appeal to evolution works. I think you need something more there. And if you don't want to posit the existence of God, then I'm not sure what you can possibly appeal to. And I think that's currently why I am not a staunch... the reason we call it your mind is because it's attached to your body. I think that's just a bit of a cop-out, because I could say the same thing with... for example, I also know a lot of dualists wouldn't like to accept that because they want to believe in the the existence of the mind after bodily death as well. So this is really out there, but what if it's the case that brains are similar to radios in the sense that our brains pick up a consciousness signal and it's playing out this? So that's a great explanation, right? Like, we can posit all these explanations as to why it occurs, but we need to have some sort of evidence for it existing, and for it to be more legitimate than any other explanation. And so we would need to have motivational reasons to accept this radio theory, that, like, we would need to find something in the physical world that would sort of function in the same way. But as it stands right now, we appear to, like Lycan says, have prima facie reason to believe our minds are behind our eyes, right? Just sit where you are right now and you look around, okay? And I think, right? You get this very prima facie, and prima facie means like sort of before investigation, like it just seems intuitively true at first, and that gives you reason to believe it. It seems intuitively true that my mind is located at least roughly in the same space as my body, and specifically behind my eyes. That just seems so intuitively obvious to us that we would need to have more reason to doubt this than not. So I think that would probably be the response to that. So it seems so, you sort of get what David Lewis calls the stare. What's it called? It's called, can't remember, but basically you incredulous stare. Thank you very much. You get this incredulous stare at this idea that, you know, there are a bunch of minds out there, and then there are radio transmissions sending it to our brain. That just seems very incredibly incorrect, I think, on the face of it, you know. But yeah, it does seem ad hoc. That's right. Or what seems ad hoc? The radio thing, or that the eyes are behind the eyes, or that the mind is behind the eyes? When I say I mean like behind the eyes. Like, my mind is located in my head, behind my eyes. Hello, Yaya, or Jaja. So, hopefully that should. And now, like, I want to talk about just a little bit more generally about Cartesian dualism. I mean, we seem to be facing a specter in the philosophical tradition of people abandoning naturalism, of people abandoning this idea that naturalism is ultimately the correct way to approach philosophy. And specifically in the philosophy of mind, there seems to be a lot of compelling reasons to ultimately JP Hamster, I'm so glad you brought up property dualism. So Lycan wrote a sequel to this paper that I just covered, I think in the Wiley guidebook to substance dualism, where he essentially argues that property dualism faces more issues than substance dualism does, and that property dualism doesn't meet any of the I think it meets two objections better than substance dualism does. But property dualism brings with it a whole host of other problems that the substance dualist wouldn't need to face. Right. So specifically with materialism, there are a ton of issues with materialism. There's certainly no agreement on how we are supposed to be materialists or how we're supposed to be physicalists. And as we've said, most materialists and physicalists now in the philosophy of mind are no longer, reductionists. They no longer believe that we can just reduce everything in the mind down to something that is purely physical. They will often take something like, I've always been inclined towards Chalmers' theory of naturalistic dualism, which argues that there aren't two types of substances. But in the same way that I say that a chair exists, and also all the stuff that makes up the chair exists, I can say that the mind exists on its own and it's not reducible, but that the physical world also exists, or the physical entities that make it up also exist, but you can't necessarily reduce one to the other. That is something that I would, but that also has a whole host of host of issues as well. If you're interested in reading about dualism very specifically, I mean the classical way to go about it would just be to read Descartes' Meditations, and then maybe read Leibniz if you're interested in a different solution to the interaction problem that actually makes sense, but unfortunately appeals to the existence of God, which most people aren't going to be sympathetic to. For modern forms of dualism, you could read John Foster. You could read Van Inwagen, who I believe believes in animalism. Ross, W.H. Ross, I believe his name is. There's some other people as well. But for the classical objections to Cartesian dualism or substance dualism, the locus classicus is definitely Gilbert Ryle's The Concept of Mind. You know, there he talks about Descartes' ghost in the machine. And ultimately, I disagree with the arguments in that, but that's definitely what ushered a new age in the philosophy of mind, where people abandoned substance dualism in droves. And then Yagwon Kim has some papers on dualism. Lycan's paper, obviously, that I just read, I really suggest. Yeah. Hopefully this was... Look, I mean, there's so much more we could talk about philosophy of mind, but I hopefully... I have to go to the washroom, so I just need to go on break for like 3 minutes or so, but I will be back. But hopefully this was good, guys. But don't go anywhere, because I'll be right back, and then we'll talk about more philosophy stuff, and I'll answer questions and stuff. Don't worry, I'm not ending. Don't worry, High TV. I'm just going to the washroom, but I will be right back, and you can listen to a fantastic song while you wait. Literally 3 minutes. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. I love you all. I'll be right back. Okay. Hey, thanks so much. Flipper, the Mad King 6, Rostafarian, Jacob 3123, Stormy Winks, VFRTYV for following. And so hopefully you got something out of that whole lecture stream on the philosophy of mind, and specifically Cartesian dualism. If you want to help support my channel, help me earn minimum wage, you can either donate by hitting the button down below, or you can help me try to reach the goal here by subscribing. If you have Amazon Prime, you get Twitch Prime, which means you get a free sub a month. So you can subscribe that way, and every little bit helps. So, yeah, I love you all. Thank you. Rem, can you talk about the philosophy of blasting your biceps and making sick gains? Unfortunately, no, because I don't do strength training. Sadly. I'm sure there is something like that. Good job standing up for First Nations rights, Rem. I like that arc. Yeah, thanks so much, Serves. Actually, right here, right next to me, I have my copy of Memi's The Colonizer and the Colonized. I think I've read this like 3 times. It's short. It's a great book. People interested in indigenous rights and the role of colonialism in the world should definitely read Colonizing the Colonized. Oh, your mom is Métis. Very interesting. Okay, I have some friends who work with Métis governments in setting up treaty rights with the federal government. But I don't know enough about Métis history. I really need to learn a lot more. That chair looks dope. I don't know. It's I don't know. Just an office chair that I picked up on sale. But beyond that, I don't honestly really know. Nashi. Oh, the one in the back. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. It's not very cozy, though. That's why I use this one. Oh. What ethical theory do you base your vegan views on? I mean, I identify as a Parfitian, so it's sort of like a moral pluralism. But the point is that I don't think there's any consistent or plausible moral theory where you shouldn't be vegan. Right, so if you're a utilitarian, you believe in maximizing well-being, maximizing pleasure, depending on the type of utilitarian that you are. It's quite clear that animals of all types experience pleasure. And so if you're a utilitarian, you should also be vegan. There's no non-ad hoc way to say that only human well-being is what matters. That's just, it doesn't make sense. Because if I were then to say, well, what if some alien creatures come down, identical to us in every way, but they are not human beings, they are some alien race, but they're made of silicon. Are you just now going to say, well, their well-being doesn't matter at all because they aren't human? So what is so special about the biological makeup of us that makes us, so deserving of moral consideration, but other species are not deserving of moral consideration? So to utilitarianism, it's certainly not plausible, I think, to not be vegan. Under virtue ethics, I mean, it's clearly virtuous to be a vegan. I don't know enough about virtue, but I don't know any virtue. Most of the vegans that I know are virtue ethicists. Oddly enough, yeah, most vegans that I know in philosophy are virtue ethicists. And then with regard, the reason I was not vegan, the reason I wasn't vegan for a very long time, and why I would argue against veganism, is because I ascribe moral wealth to being a rational agent, capable of, abstract thinking, and so forth. And I rooted this in a sort of Kantian deontological stance, where to be a moral agent and deserving of moral well-being necessitates having a certain degree of consciousness that I thought animals didn't have. And then I read Christine Korsgaard's book, and Fellow Creatures is what it's called. And every sort of argument that I had ever posed against veganism, she sort of just shot down in really extremely well argued chapters. And at that point, the only ethical theory I could really see, being consistent with not being vegan was a form of deontology. And I mean, I don't know, the leading deontologist is one of the most outspoken critics of not being vegan. And the arguments that she gives all come from a constructivist deontological framework. And it is, it's really, it really just sort of reshaped my whole worldview, to be honest. Your discussion with Vaughn convinced me to be vegan, though. I wasn't arguing for veganism on his stream. I wasn't concerned with arguing for veganism. So that wasn't what that discussion was about. So yeah, that's why I'm vegan. I think other people should be vegan too, but I'm not a vegan crusader, right? So there are lots of really competent people in philosophy who defend veganism and fight for veganism, and I think they can do a much better job. I think they can do a much better job at arguing for veganism than I can. It's also an area of discourse that's extremely toxic. So, Hearst House is very good, yeah. Rem, do you think it's possible that the study of philosophy in the realm of like political debate has become excessively intertwined? I mean, it's intertwined by necessity. All political claims are ethical claims. I'm eating blueberry or raspberries. Yeah, all political claims are ethical claims, so of course it's going to be intertwined. I think what you're seeing exposed is that when push comes to shove, people who discuss politics on certain platforms aren't actually capable of justifying their positions. And so then you'll see them bashing philosophy as being useless. But the only reason that they say that is because they are quite literally incapable of justifying their positions. That's been my whole spiel, right? I wrote an article on this on my website where, like, so if I say to someone, you need to make sure that you're being ethical, you need to ensure that the political positions that you're arguing for are rooted in ethically good grounds. And then they'll say, well, look, if I did that, I wouldn't be able to, be fighting for workers' rights, yada, yada, yada. Now, the issue with it, and like, I agree, right, to an extent. The issue is the argument doesn't work because you're begging the question. You can't rely on your ethical framework to justify why you shouldn't justify your ethical framework. Like that's the whole thing up for consideration, is whether your ethical position is justified. And to say that I shouldn't justify it because it would go counter to my ethical framework is itself, it's circular. But that's the only argument that they can give, is that it's unpractical. It's not practical under their moral framework. And it's a bad argument, and it doesn't make sense. So, but they're just not capable or willing to spend the time doing the necessary research on these subjects. Who says that? Tons of people say that. That was the main objection I would get to my position on this. I'll talk about Kant. I'm having a Kant podcast, Haggold, soon, or than later. It seems like the amount of time one would have to spend is enormous. I mean, let's say that's even true. So what? The argument against it, again, is going to be circular. I mean, many philosophers believe that to live a good life, you need to study philosophy. To live a truly virtuous good life involves contemplating philosophy. So, I don't think I agree with that, but the point is that in order to object, to provide a counter to this, requires you to go into philosophy and not presuppose your ethical position. So you can argue against it on like an epistemic ground, but they don't know epistemology, so they can't do that. Or the way that I object to it is essentially by saying, well, look, under any plausible moral framework, it is consistent to do X, right? So even though I might not be 100% certain that my ethical framework is correct, I can identify certain things that are necessary under any consistent, plausible moral theory. And that's how I do it. That's usually how I give those arguments. And I think that's pretty successful. And I'm happy with that, to be honest. But, it's a complicated issue, and I get into spats about it on Twitter. But I don't discuss it now on this stream with people because it's not worth. It's not worth. Would you say, politics is applied philosophy. That's what it is, for sure. Everything's applied philosophy. It just comes out more in politics because it's a direct continuation of applying ethics at a broad level. VFRTYF. It depends on your background, what you're interested in. I have a reading list online. Yeah, I have no idea. It totally depends on what your interest is in philosophy. Yeah, thank you, Bubble. But again, so people will try to bait me to to have like debates on my stream. And I just think to myself, what do I gain from this? What do I, because it's all good, you know, what do I gain? I know viewers gain because they like content. Right? People want content. That's fine. But I'm not really doing, I don't, for my own mental health, it's not enjoyable. Right? I used to go on the Raj Royale. I didn't enjoy it. Yeah, I would leave it and get a ton of views afterwards, but I did not enjoy it, and it was not worth the cost of it. I would rather have my channel be about spreading philosophy to people in a serious way that's mature, in good faith, and rooted in, education, and not stupid cheap shots at people. Do I deem philosophy or destiny as bad faith? No. He can be, but he's not a bad faith person. It's weird that he surrounds himself with people who are so clearly that, but he himself, no. Definitely not. Like, there are a lot of people in the Destiny community that I really like. I like Mooten a lot. Mooten's a really great guy. I stand for Mooten. Doesn't Mooten hate you? I think we used to hate each other, but I feel like we've since grown to appreciate each other, maybe, But yeah. Hey, Ron, I was curious if you could elaborate on what it means to have a substantiated belief. It means being able to give a plausible argument for a belief that you have. Being able to root it in evidence. Being able to provide a theoretical, deductive argument for a certain position. Being able to consider objections to the issue and have responses to those objections. Being familiar with the alternatives to your belief. Okay, silly stuff. No, none of that. No sexist slurs in chat, please. Cringe. Imagine using slurs in 2020. Wow. There's a lot of issues that I talk about, like specifically that revolve around Twitch, that are and this is part of the issue, right? That I want to make Twitch a better platform, but in order to really do that and to get the platform to do it, I found that I had to engage in the type of behavior that I was also sort of criticizing. Not in the same way, right? But when I go on the Raj Royale, I would have to be, in a sense, sort of toxic and abrasive, because that would keep me going, and that would draw attention, and that would get the clips. And then people hear my message through, a very loud speakerphone. But at the end of the day, I don't enjoy doing that because that's not how I genuinely like to interact with people. So it's difficult. It's difficult to find the fine line between having a positive effect on people, while also getting the amount of reach that you need in order to have an effect on people. One sec. Sorry, someone sent me a message. I think the worst part of that style is pure critique is not enough. An alternative needs to be provided. You had this issue with Vosh when you're making good points, but being disregarded because there's no alternative. So, no, I still disagree with that. It doesn't matter if I can't present an alternative if your argument is deductively invalid. That's what people need to recognize, right? This is the analogy that I was giving. If I give... Oh, a Leibniz lecture. Oh, yeah, I can do that. The reality is that if I write a math proof to prove a certain conjecture, and somewhere in my proof is a step that's invalid, that means that my proof doesn't work. So if someone comes to me and points out the error, I can't then say, well, you don't have a solution. That's not how that works. As soon as you see the error, the clearly deductive invalid error that's in your proof, you throw out the proof. You don't sit there and hold on to it because no one else... No, because if it's invalid, that necessarily means that it is impossible to be true. And in that sense, it's just as valid as anything else. And that is ridiculous. So, that's what I would say to that. But it's less invalid than the other invalids. I don't know about that. I'm struggling to even remember the Vosh debate now. I have the whole response video on my YouTube channel if people are interested in that. But I cannot remember, I can't really remember the discussion now. I just have a bad memory. But I don't know. I think I'll come back to it in the future. But right now I can't really remember. I can't even remember what the analogy was really being used for. A way of living that is faulty can still produce useful outcomes. Well, that's only if you inherently value outcomes. But if you are someone who believes that the goodness of someone comes from their will and their intentions, then good outcomes doesn't matter if the intention is always incorrect. Which is what a deontologist would say, for example. Yeah, morally lucky. That's exactly right, yeah. Bryn. I'm not sure who Bryn is. Bosch is definitely consequentialist. Yes, I know. Yeah. That's fine. That's fine, JP. But the issue here with math, though, right, is that mathematics and the truths about mathematics are something that is inherently, like, those are things that can be clearly true to us just on basic introspection, right? Like, the geometric laws that he posits, we can know the conclusion is true before giving the proper proof for it. But that's just simply not the same. It's obviously not the same in philosophy, right? Where there's so much disagreement. No one is going to disagree with, the basic proofs that Euler gives in geometries, right? But that's just not a good analogy, I think, to something like philosophy, where the positions don't always strike us as intuitively and necessarily correct, and where there is a whole host of debate, even on people who have literally been studying the subject for decades, sometimes their entire lives. I'd wager that if you value outcomes, then you should necessarily value intention and grounding, since on the macro scale, this is the way to get it. Yeah, that is true. I would agree with that as well. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is true. I don't know if Vosh is an act utilitarian or rule utilitarian, though. I mean, I'd hope he's a rule utilitarian. I don't know any act utilitarians because it's a really absurd position, but that's okay. Okay, so there's a couple things we could do. I could play the Talos principle for a little bit, or I could try to have someone come discuss a topic in philosophy with me. Like, I could see if Marty's online right now. Let's see if he wants to talk. Can I run a poll in the how do I run a poll? Oh, here we go. Create a poll. Okay. What should I do? Philosophy person talk. Duration 2 minutes while I go to the washroom again. I've been drinking a lot of water. Okay, I'll be right back. Literally 1 minute. 1 sec. Vote. Okay. Let us see. Let's see what we've got here, huh? Let us see. Okay, that's pretty overwhelming, isn't it? Okay, let's see. Let's see if Marty is on online. Or perspective philosophy. Next. What's next? Ooh. Maybe just do a Destiny and play Talos while talking philosophy. Who is Tay Jump or T Jump? I'm not sure I know what that is. Also, I remember. It's a little chilly. Do a destiny? Okay. Sure. Let's do that then. I did go vegan, yeah. I've been vegan for like what, 3 months now? 2 months. 1 month? Something. I can't even remember now. I can't even keep track. The Taos game isn't very good for that since you'll have to skip over a lot of text in the game. I see. Brain dead game. I don't usually game while I stream. It's a little difficult, isn't it? I play RuneScape. I don't want to play RuneScape. Also, you'll hear the clicking, and isn't that annoying to people? It's annoying to me. If veganism is valid, then why does meat taste so good? It's a really good point. Ugh, meat does taste good. I'm not even like the biggest fan of meat eating, to be honest. But I mean, you know, you still miss it, right? And even still, I'll slip up and I'll eat something that is that has animal products because I forget or I don't even realize that it has. Like when I go home, for example, I do sometimes have to eat meat. Like when I go home, because sometimes that's the only thing available, and that's what's made for me, you know. Which I guess I really shouldn't do, but it's pretty difficult, to be honest. They're faced when you're a League viewer, so your brain automatically cancels out the clicking. Oh my god, no, I'll never play League. Oh man. Someone said Subnautica. I could play Subnautica. Or I could play Terraria. Eames Lounge. I don't know what it is. I don't know. It's just a chair I got. I have no idea what it is. It doesn't have a logo. Just a chair. People keep commenting on the chair for some reason. Terraria. I haven't really played a lot of Terraria, to be honest. If you want to do Terraria, I'm sort of blind to it. The farthest I've ever gotten was the Eye of Cthulhu. So, yeah, like I only have 20 hours in the game. And most of that was because I'm pretty sure I forgot to launch it. But is the clicking going to be annoying for people? It's annoying for me, but that's because I have sensory issues and I have audio sensitivity. But if people are totally fine to watch me play Terraria while talking philosophy, and people find that entertaining, I'm willing to do that. I will be chat's bitch, okay? So, there we go. Pull the clicking annoyance. I haven't seen anyone say it. It really bothers them, to be honest. So, is Marty even on? I don't think so. Okay. Where is Terraria? It says it's running, but it hasn't come up. Uh-oh. Whoa! Silent Soul Ticker! 400 bits! Hey, thank you so much! Oh my god, yes! Guys! That's right, I have a community! That means that we can play together! Wow! Isn't this exciting? Yeah, let's have a group Terraria thing. Is this exciting or what? Okay, how do I do this? Do I have to host a server? I have to host a server, right? I've done that before. Let me quickly do that. I think I still have the files. Is my internet good enough? I could help if you want. Yeah, that'd be fantastic. Or is it gonna be boring just watching me just quickly set this up? But it shouldn't be an issue though. It's very easy. But for some reason, my Terraria is not actually launching. It says it's running, but it won't launch. I might have to reinstall it. Oh, nope, there it is. It's just really low quality. Oh, no, it's fine. Okay. Let's play. Okay, and then new. What size world do we want? I hear people say small is the best world size, but also large. Oh yeah, if we're having other people, large is probably better, right? Okay, fine. Large. We're gonna do normal. Enter world name. What was that? Oh my god. It's so great every time. Hey, thank you so much, Emrear. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the $10. Yes, I'll keep fighting against the nihilists. We will own the nihilists. I'm trying to think of what to name the world. You can do Duo Terraria. I don't think Soft has Terraria. Let's see, let's phone him up. Actually, I think he's offline right now. Rim's house. Probably the bathhouse, right? That's the name of my Discord server. Okay. I think Soft is asleep. Yeah, Soft is asleep. Should I? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Everyone is welcome. Or should I set like you have to pay me $500 in order to join the game? I'm kidding. I'm not doing that. Yeah, look, thank you, Silent Soul Ticker, for the 400 bits, and thank you so much, Emrare, for the $10. Really appreciate it. 200 subs. Yeah, sub or kick. Is that something I should do? I feel bad doing that. But like everyone, I don't know. It makes me feel uncomfortable. Thanks so much, last username, for following. Thanks, Alex6858. Thanks, Valpoke, Quarter Past Midnight, and Space Cowboy. Thank you guys for following. I really appreciate it. Then you'd be playing alone. You'll feel less bad. Oh, might be better to at least sub to make sure no one comes in and spams N-words. Right. Okay. That is true. That is true. Okay. Fine. I will do you have to be subbed. Okay. I'd say don't make, but I don't want, but I can't just have anyone be able to come in and do it, right? Probably a problem in this community. Just moderate it. Okay. I don't know how moderation works. Look, I'm largely indifferent to it. Whatever will make things easier. Whatever will make things easier, then there you go. That's what I'll do, okay? But I don't have a preference here. Can you mute the end game? Yeah, but people can still build stuff, which is the issue, right? Okay, here we go. Here we go. Dedicated server file. Whoa, the Terraria website looks really nice now, eh? Save file. Wait, configuration file. I'm already Oh yeah, is that what we want to do? Do we want to can I just host it? How many people can join just by like joining the game through Steam? because that'll be a lot easier than me hosting a server. And also, I think I give out my IP when I host it, which I don't really want to do, to be honest. So having people just join through Steam, I think, would be a lot easier if that's a thing that is possible. 8 players max. What is the what about with the regular server? What is the limit with normal servers? What's the amount otherwise? I can create the game and let it run on my computer. Okay, yeah, Gino, if you want to set that up, that'd be fantastic. Yeah, I'm trying to be self-sufficient. So far, I've been able to, with my 80 cents, with my 83 cents, I am able to, with my 83 cents, I'm able to buy, what? I don't know. The philosophy chat. What's this? Oh, hey, look, it's, there's an official, oh, it's Marty. Oh, you've changed your Twitch name to the philosophy chat now, which is an excellent Discord, by the way, everyone, that you should definitely join. Okay? Google the philosophy chat on Google. They have reading groups. It's excellent. Just don't be silly or you're going to get the weenie roll. Okay? It's very, very important. Okay. Yeah, I just got it. What's your picture? Oh, no, there's another one. Okay, I sent it. Wow, what a badass profile picture that is. How can I play? Why are you in my chat if you're streaming? What? I have a limited tolerance for philosophy in general. Yeah, me too, to be honest. I also people, I still keep getting PMs of people asking me to debate. Whoa, there's a black and white. Is JoJo's Bizarre Adventures good? I have never seen it. Property dualism is the base position to adopt. I don't think so. I don't know about that. Have you watched or read Berserk? No, but it's on my list. Last night I was up and I started watching Dororo or Dororo. Is it Dororo? Yeah, Dororo. It's fine. That's all very good. Yeah, the bathhouse. Bathhouse is one word. It's the same as the Discord server name. That one is meh. Dororo. You know what I like? Mushishi. Mushishi is the best anime of all time. And if you don't like that, then you can leave my you can this next. Let's see here. If you like Mushishi, you might like Cowboy Bebop. Yeah, there's a lot of things I need to watch. Look, does anyone in here hate anime with a passion? Or all of you guys weebs? Yes, me? Really? You hate anime. Me. Bazuzu. Bazuzu. Okay, guys, look, we're almost ready to set up. Look, we're just gonna play, but then I'm gonna talk philosophy while I play. So that's the plan. You know what is really funny? It's I see this all the time on Twitter, but people like worship the Tractatus, and it's really really cringeworthy. People think that like all philosophy stopped after the Tractatus, as though like the Tractatus doesn't have like a ton of problems, of which like Wittgenstein was hyper aware. Yeah, yes, Gino. Mononoke. Yeah, I've heard of Mononoke. That sounds like a Destiny's Discord philosophy group thing. No, I don't see no. There's a couple people in his community that wank themselves off to early Wittgenstein. But in general, I mean, I don't usually I just see in Destiny's community a lot of like hardcore physicalists, a lot of moral anti-realists, etc. Psychopaths. I tried starting Psychopaths, but it was too cliche for me, I felt. So I stopped watching it. Can you read Summa Theologica? It's only 1,200 pages. I think I read part of Summa Theologica for a philosophy of sexuality course of all things, actually, which is interesting.